I'm not sure whether my knowledge of Gallipoli is anywhere near as good as most of the people on the talk tonight. And also my knowledge of chaplaincy might be questioned by a former chaplain, but we'll see how we go. Okay, here goes. William Flynn, the Roman Catholic padre attached to the first Royal Dublin Fusiliers, perished during the legendary amphibious assault on V Beach on the 25th of April, 1915. He ignored a direct order to absent himself from the battalion as it approached the shore under fierce Ottoman machine gun fire. The steadfast chaplain, however, did go, and he was struck by a hail of bullets. Seriously wounded, he carried on comforting the wounded until his own death shortly later. He was the first British Roman Catholic padre to die in action during the First World War. His fatal decision to flout official orders is one that was emulated by many other chaplains when confronting the unique as opposed to the Western Front difficulties and dangers experienced throughout the Gallipoli campaign. The decision to land with his troops, I guess, it was one that was emulated, and it's emblematic of the difficulties and dangers experienced by chaplains in a battle arena which conditions made a nonsense of that difference between the first front line and safe area for bases, field ambulances and supply depots. It didn't exist. As the close proximity of field ambulances and camps to the front line fighting, this made the distinction between them very much less clear. And the role of the chaplains and the circumstances in which they operated meant that they had to work out their role in different ways from that already experienced on the Western Front. For all the chaplains in Gallipoli, many without a military background, and some of the British chaplains, their experiences at Gallipoli were their first and formative experiences of experiencing 20th century technological warfare. So, in this talk, I'm going to look briefly at the way the chaplain's role had developed since the beginning of the war, and then examine how the role developed in different conditions of the Gallipoli theatre and how this impacted on their roles during the rest of the war. By early 1915, the temporary chaplains of the forces were experiencing the development of trench warfare on the Western Front, while simultaneously trying to identify their role within the BEF. Now, although the regular chaplains had performed very efficiently on the retreat from Mons, the mobilisation of the temporary chaplains had been somewhat chaotic, with no provision for postings, rations or transport. Roger Lloyd, historian of 20th century Anglicanism, commented on the chaplain's task, observed, quote, "He could indeed become necessary, but he must create that necessity himself." Were they to be purveyors of holy grocery, expending their energies on provision of material comforts and troop recreation, or were the spiritual needs of all ranks to be their primary role? When behind the lines, was the chaplain's place to administer services at base camp and hospitals and take funerals? Was he best attached to a field ambulance? Was he to provide spiritual succour or medical assistance practically with the injured? Was he really meant to be organising tea urns and giving out cigarettes, spending time on the tedious task of censoring letters? From the outset, the respective army headquarters developed a general policy of forbidding chaplains to enter the front line because it was believed they would serve no useful purpose there. These orders were very often disregarded, especially by Roman Catholic chaplains who had the theological imperative of administrating the sacraments of Holy Communion or the last rites to the dying. This led to the very contentious perception highlighted in the post-war publications of Siegfried Sassoon and Robert Graves and Guy Chapman, among others, that Roman Catholic padres were fearless and of more use at the front than the other denominations. There was, however, a great deal of high-level opposition to the army orders from the Anglican and Reformed churches, in addition to the chaplains themselves. Senior chaplain Neville Talbot was extremely outspoken about official prescription, and as he was the son of a famous bishop and had lots of connections, political as well, he used these connections as a means of expressing satisfaction. I think there were numerous letters to the Guardian. The Reverend Edmund Kennedy, who embarked for France at the beginning of the war, observed, quote, "The question is often asked, should a chaplain be under fire? It is impossible to avoid this if he is serving troops under fire, and he must take his chances like everyone else." For example, the Reverend Maurice Peel was badly wounded going forward with his battalion during the First Battle of Ypres and died later on at Bullecourt. Nevertheless, BF chaplains were still discouraged to enter the front line as late as order 1915. So the Gallipoli campaign commenced after the Army Chaplains Department had a certain amount of experience in the chaplain's role in battle. The principal Mediterranean/Middle East chaplain was the Reverend A.W. Horden. The Gallipoli landings put a huge strain on Horden's chaplains. Chaplains being required for troop ships, for hospital ships, base camps, as well as on the peninsula. Life on Gallipoli was harsh. The flies, the lice, the poor food, scarcity of water, disease, climate, the presence of snipers, and the presence of dead made for hardship. So let's have a look at some of the background and training of British and Anzac chaplains. The Australian Army Chaplains Department had been formed as early as 1913. Each denomination, Anglican, Presbyterian, Roman Catholic and Methodist, had an appointed senior chaplain. The four ranks of chaplain, first to fourth class, were the military ranks of captain, major, lieutenant colonel and colonel, as in the British Department. At the outbreak of war, it was decided that chaplains from each denomination in Australia would be allocated based on the 1911 census. Chaplains who were engaged on a voyage-only contract would embark with the troops to their destination and then do a hospital ship service on the return voyage, whereas chaplains over between 20 and 40 years of age remained on continuous contracts. According to the Australian War Memorial, chaplains were overwhelmingly of a British origin. Chaplains had little training, but had the long sea voyage to settle into their role and familiarise themselves to the troops. The official historian, H.S. Gullett, explained their difficulties. He said, quote, "The chaplain was to be a man's man and a soldier of Christian character. Were they to be religious guides only, mainly welfare officers, counsellors, fighters, or loafers?" I like the loafers bit. It was up to the individual chaplain to find out. Michael McKernan, in his study of the AIF chaplains, commented on the antipathy of many of the Australian men to religion. He said, "Many officers and men merely tolerated the chaplains, looking at their appointments as an example of the Australian habit of paying lip service to religion." Many of the chaplains who volunteered for service from Britain were from privileged backgrounds, many having attended Oxbridge colleges. However, many had taken advantage of the opportunity to work and live in East End university settlements, or had served as curates in tough working class parishes. These experiences would have provided them with the opportunity to expand their social horizons. Other chaplains' pre-war experience included prison chaplaincy, school work, and missionary work. So it's evident that many of the Church of England clergy and others who became chaplains had a variety of pre-war experience, whether or not they had been educated in a privileged system. Their training, however, if any, as chaplains was woefully inadequate, leaving it very much up to the initiative of the individual chaplain to create a role for themselves. Some of the Church of England chaplains certainly came from such privileged backgrounds. Oh, hang on, sorry. Let's see, there he is. The Reverend William Wand later became bishop in Australia, became Bishop of Brisbane, obtained a first-class honours at St Edmund's Hall, Oxford. Wand became Vicar of Old Sarum in 1915 and then disembarked at Gallipoli in July 1915. Here we have the Reverend Arthur Groom Parham. He was precentor of Christ Church Cathedral, Oxford, where he was appointed chaplain in August 1914, prior to joining the South Midlands Mounted Brigade. Here we have Oswin Creighton, another son of a prominent clerical family, graduated from Keble College, trained in Farnham Hostel, and was very much part of the English ecclesiastical establishment. Roman Catholic Father William Finn, we've talked about and we'll talk about a little bit later, hailed from Hull and was educated at Shaw College, County Durham, the premier Roman Catholic seminary of Northern England. Father H.C. Day, prior to his enlistment, was officiating at the Holy Name Parish in central Manchester. This Jesuit was so keen to enlist that he approached the Lord Mayor of Manchester for assistance with immediate assignment to a battalion bound for overseas service. Assigned to the 2nd Midland Mounted Brigade. Other Catholic chaplains included Father T.A. Harker, chaplain to the Royal Munster Fusiliers, and Father Francis Charles Davis, who entered the Jesuit order at 18. Among the nonconformist padres were several from Scotland. The Reverend Hunter Smith was a minister of the Crieff United Free Church, and William Ewing, having previously served a minister to the Edinburgh United Free Church, was attached to the Royal Scots. As in Great Britain, there were initially more Australian applicants than available vacancies for chaplains, such was the prevailing enthusiasm. Many were middle-aged, but these volunteers were usually assigned troopships. The maximum age to accompany troops in battle was only up to 40. Hang on, that is William Ewing's memorial. And as you can see, after Gallipoli, he went on to serve in Jerusalem and died in 1932. Sorry, where were we? William Mackenzie, yes. Salvation Army, the only Salvation Army chaplain from Australia. He was known as Fighting Mac, and he had a very big personality. You might call him a sort of muscular Christian. We'll talk a little bit more about him later. Reverend Walter Dexter was a very popular Anzac personality, and he was an Anglican. One of the 12 chaplains whose official appointment date from 8th of September 1914, and he had previous service in the South African War, as well as and being in a merchant seaman. And there we are with his. We can see him with his life belt on the way. Okay, sorry. Yes, so these experiences provided him with a lot of valuable life experience to draw on. Wesleyan Senior Minister James Green had also experienced service as a chaplain in South Africa. The Reverend Andrew Gilson had held posted in Scotland and the United States before immigrating to Brisbane. Now, the senior Anglican chaplain of the AIF was Albert Edward Talbot, Dean of Sydney. Keith Best, a British chaplain, on encountering him during the voyage to Gallipoli, observed, this is what he said about him: "He has very broad views, says we fall behind the Roman Catholics every time, for example, in services and discipline. He considers that Holy Communion should be taught as essential, the service of absolution and forgiveness of sin. He wants to teach congregations to put a hold on certain non-essentials, for example, the virgin birth and the bodily resurrection of Jesus, etc., etc. He would like to teach modern critical view of inspiration of the Bible. He would run a parish mainly for men. He would take matins and Holy Communion and football in the afternoon and leave Sunday school to the lay people and even song to the curate. He was a great scholar with a double first in theology." Now, I think he sounds as if he'd be probably still quite controversial in today's Anglican Church. The New Zealand Expeditionary Force embarked from New Zealand on October 1914. Among its numbers were William Grant, who was to die at Gallipoli, and Father Patrick Doe, posted to the Wellington Rifles. Grant originally hailed from Scotland, but he was educated in New Zealand before becoming ordained in the Presbyterian Church in 1890. Doe, a native of Southern Ireland, administered in Kaikoura and Foxton prior to embarkation with the Auckland Mounted Rifles and his subsequent death in action. I hope I pronounced this right. The Reverend Hinari Waipia Wainuhu was a Maori chaplain educated at Ote College. He joined the Maori contingent as a reinforcement just prior to landing in Gallipoli in July 1915. A sermon preached by Te Wehano prior to embarkation was widely quoted at the time. In it, he encouraged the troops to fearlessly uphold the Maori warrior tradition. Grant's farewell address expressed unequivocal support for the war effort. This is not the time for words, it's a time for deeds. From north and south, and from east and west, our sons are marching and sailing to the help of the old motherland and to defend our possessions and liberties. Oops, let me just carry on to, we get back there. Here we go. Right, let's look at the actual landings. At V Beach on the 25th of April, Father Finn, as we saw earlier, in the Royal Dublin Fusiliers, was being processed of being towed ashore in rowboats, and he refused to remain on the River Clyde. The actual events of his wounding and death are confused in several different accounts, but there is no doubt that he died tending to the wounded, despite after being wounded almost immediately after landing. A report from a Reuters correspondent based in Egypt had Finn leaving the SS Clyde with the troops and being wounded almost immediately before scrambling over the lighters to the beach. It said, he stepped off the gangway and immediately received a bullet through the chest. Undeterred, he made his way across the lighters, receiving a bullet in his thigh and another bullet in his leg. By the time he reached the beach, he was riddled with bullets, but in spite of the great pain, he must have been suffering heroically as he went about his duties, giving consolation to the dying troops. It was while in the act of attending to the spiritual needs of one of his men that the priest's head was shattered by shrapnel. The Reverend T.A. Harker, who buried Finn later that day, had no doubt about whatever the actual sequence of events, because different sources give different sequence of events. Whatever the sequence of events, now lost in the fog of war, that Finn's actions were not exaggerated. He said, quote, good, zealous priest that he was, he needs no lies to endure his memory among the Dublins. The Reverend Oswin Creighton, whose picture we saw earlier, wrote about Finn's relationship with the battalion, quote, the men never forgot him and were never tired of speaking of him. I think they felt his death almost more than anything that happened on that terrible landing. Creighton himself was with the field hospital on board ship on the 25th of April and was conscious of the principal's orders that the chaplains were not to advance further than the dressing stations. But following the landings, Horden, the principal chaplain, realised that conditions rendered previous instructions redundant, as Creighton subsequently observed. Later, the principal chaplain laid it down quite clearly that while under normal circumstances, the above rule is the best to follow, each chaplain must use his own discretion and be where he feels he can do the greatest use to the men. At this stage of the proceedings, before landing, Creighton seemed to agree with the orders given. He said, the chaplain is a non-combatant, and surely it must be wrong for him to go out on the attack, much though he may hate not to share the danger of his men to the full. His work comes after the attack, and perhaps most of all when the men come away tired and worn out for a rest, or when they are spending those continuous days of wearisome strain in the trenches. And not least of all is the fact he is the best channel of communication between the men and home. Very often he is asked to promise to write if anything should happen, and the little personal letters the chaplain can write home are the most welcome, and the knowledge that all can be done by a decent burial has been done. Creighton's Field Hospital eventually landed on the 2nd of May, the 86th Field Ambulance having finally disembarked. Creighton, after assisting Hawker with funeral services, carried on work with his assigned unit. On the 6th of May, he noticed that the 88th Brigade's Line Infantry regiments were on the front line. Meanwhile, at the dressing stations, he said, it was very difficult to know what to do. Either the wounded were able to hobble off to the casualty clearing station, or they were so bad they were given morphia. So I went back to the camp to see the wounded as they came in. I went to the casualty clearing station and chatted as far as possible to the ones I saw. However, it was impossible to make things any better. Keith Best landed on the 6th of May, the first day of the Second Battle of Krithia. His senior chaplain, hang on a minute, we need to go down, there we are, Keith Best. His senior chaplain assigned him to the 126th East Lancashire Brigade Royal Army Medical Corps, then disembarking on the peninsula. Best was appalled by the lack of medical officers and stretcher bearers. He seems to have adjusted to prevailing conditions more easily than Creighton. By the 9th of May, the day after landing, he had collected the many unburied corpses lying about before burying them in a new cemetery. On the 8th of May, he observed, quote, as usual, a day of blood. Went up the nullah, stray bullets spattering the sand, streams of New Zealand wounded coming down at the top of the gully as we formed a cemetery and buried a number of the poor fellows. And then he added tellingly, no one scoffs at religion now. By the 11th of May, Best had arranged to attach himself to the 126th Brigade headquarters. Now we can see that the contrast between him and Creighton in these early days demonstrate the need for chaplains to seek out a useful role during the confusing aftermath of the landings. And it looks as if Best did it a little bit more than Creighton. However, Creighton made up for it later. Meanwhile, the Anzac landing was taking place at Ari Burnu, Anzac Cove. Father Fai, attached to the 11th Battalion, AIF, reached Imbros approximately 15 miles from the landing beach at 9 o'clock p.m. on the 25th of April. He decided to ignore orders to remain offshore, and in a piece published in the Catholic press, Fai confirmed how he flagrantly disregarded orders and sneaked off for the men. He said, it was fortunate for many a dying man that I was ashore that morning, but had I known the inferno I was rushing into, I believe I should have at this stage of the proceedings stayed behind. It goes on, the destroying extras began to man her boats, and suddenly the inferno broke loose from the shore. Such a fearful hail of bullets from the rifle, the machine gun, and the shrapnel passes all imagination. It was appalling. There was no cover. We were packed so closely together that one bullet would wound or kill 3 men. We could not hit back, for the enemy was invisible. On the boats, the men were packed closely together, and in the hail of bullets, quote, one bullet would kill 3 men, said Fai. It was horrible. I never expected to reach the shore alive. He did reach the shore, exhausted, after wading in deep water part of the way. He continued, I had made up my mind by this time that I had but a poor chance of actually getting through the morning alive. Anyhow, I picked up a flat stone, held it in front of my head, and it was fortunate I did so, because a bullet that would have brained me glanced harmlessly off. I moved forward to where the tide had made a little bank along the shore. All the soldiers carry a small entrenching tool, but being a non-combatant, I had none. I tore up the sand with my bare fingers and made a little shelter in front of me. He stayed on the beach all morning, as he was the only chaplain to land with the first wave, and was kept busy as the troops were establishing their beachhead. He continues, I remained on the beach all day and all night as the wounded were collected in a certain place to be removed to the hospital ship. After 3 weeks, Fai was still in the same set of clothes, and he had washed just twice. He had some close escapes from the shells and bullets, and he analysed his first few weeks of experience. He heard confessions in all kinds of places and went along the trenches every day in case anyone should want to see him, crawling around and tending to the wounded. Walter Dexter, regardless of strident efforts to do so, was denied this opportunity to accompany his men. He was assigned to a hospital ship as the first casualties were brought on board, and he recorded that approximately 700 casualties were treated by just 2 doctors and a few orderlies. 60-year-old Reverend John Luxford was one of the 6 chaplains who landed with the New Zealand force. On the 26th of April, he observed, "I helped our wounded this morning. With Father McMenamin, I buried 9 poor fellows. We had to shelter for an hour. The guns were booming. Then, as we read the service, we had to kneel in the dug grave. It was terrible. 6 were buried in one grave and 3 in another. Then I buried 9 more men, 4 from boats where they had been killed in trying to land under fire." Now, can I have a little bit at the services? Because to take services was one of the military chaplain's primary tasks. Conditions on the peninsula often rendered this problematic. We've got a picture here of William Mackenzie, the fighting madman conducting a burial service. Once landed, a padre had to organise services as soon as possible. It has already been demonstrated how, given the confined space available just beyond the beachheads, service provision was particularly difficult at Gallipoli. The extent of the chaplains department's collective success remained dependent on individual circumstances, physical location, and the willingness of commanding officers to grant unit attendance. Keith Best spent most of his time with burials. By the 21st of May, the necessary means to conduct services had been gathered. He managed to borrow vessels from another padre. And he said, "My altar was a pair of biscuit boxes. My vestment was a khaki shirt, a dirty, greasy tunic, and riding breeches. We fixed it for 6 a.m, hoping to anticipate the usual morning hate. Unfortunately, they rose early. To my surprise, regardless of shrapnel, about 100 men were present. Never shall I forget my first service under fire. We all felt that God's good providence watched over us, and nobody was hit." 2 days later, on Whit Sunday, Best organised a service for the East Lancashire Regiment. He said, "About 200 men were present and a dozen officers lying in dugouts. I spoke of the love and joy which accompanies true repentance. The service came under shell fire. Quote, I had not the courage to get down or take cover for fear of appearing a coward. So I got the reputation for courage, but my action was only really due to the fear of public opinion." For his part, Oswin Creighton found services difficult to arrange in the days following the landing. On the 9th of May, he observed, sorry, I lost my place now because I'm fiddling with the thingies. Yes, this is Best. Creighton, difficult to arrange the days following the landing. 9th of May, he said, it was impossible to hold services. On the 16th of May, he remarked it was, quote, unwise to have a service in the open when the shells were dropping around. He seemed surprised at the senior chaplain held a service regardless of the shell fire. Jesuit Father Francis Davis recollected how services were established in the immediate aftermath of the landings. On the southern end of the peninsula, Gallipoli, for some weeks now, Mass has been said nearly every day by the small band of Catholic chaplains. The altars are constructed variously: ammunition boxes, a board on trestles, a packing case, a shelf cut into the wall of the cliff. The place is sometimes picturesque, more often merely inconvenient. The men being huddled together behind some screen so that the existence of a shell-worthy group may not be revealed to the enemy. Walter Dexter arrived at Anzac in time for the costly Ottoman offensive on the 18th of May. No part of the police was safer than anywhere else, he said. On Sunday, the 22nd of May, held a Holy Communion celebration. Officers and men attended, and one feels that the beautiful service drew them nearer to God than they had been before. Bullets were whistling over our heads all the time, At 10 a.m, I held a voluntary service for the 2nd Brigade, and most of the men attended who could. The men dispersed and got around the humps, ready to dive out of sight. I stood on a box on the lower slope and spoke to the men. Hunter Smith observed, "Church parades in the day are rare, mostly services and prayers with small groups. Nevertheless, on one occasion after nightfall," he remembered, "the men gathered in the trenches, leaning on the parapets with the officers grouped around me. I took a central position and conducted public worship." So I'd like to look a little bit about different denominations and interdenominationalism now. The situation on the Gallipoli Peninsula was conducive to close relationships between chaplain and military and other denominations. This resulted from the frequency of funerals that brought them together. Thus, a system was worked out whereby each chaplain, regardless of denomination, took turns officiating at the evening's burial parties. Ewing shared a tent with a Roman Catholic father, Rigros. They got on well, the former recollecting good friendship with the growth of mutual understanding, became true and fast friends. Ewing concluded, "I'm glad to say that all along our area of the church was conspicuous by its services, was always ready to administer to members of any other denomination under the sun." Devotional distinctions carried little weight, especially in those days of grim realities. The chaplain, he concluded, was the friend and counsellor of everyone. However, one example of denominational tension described by Ewing was that it was impossible to hold public prayers in the hospitals on the beaches, where the men were often lying in hundreds, because, as a Roman Catholic priest quoted by Ewing put it, quote, "My men would not like hearing your prayers, nor yours mine." Ewing buried many Roman Catholics, but commented, "Yet I am informed that such a burial is not proper burial, but such as a layman might perform." According to Ewing, all the denominations of nonconformists were always anxious to join in united service, and many nonconformists were among those most constant attenders at Holy Communion. The impromptu evening services were attended by Roman Catholics also. He concluded, quote, "I'm glad to say that," oh yeah, we've had that, all along the front of the church was conspicuous by its services. So let's have a look at chaplains in action. As we've seen, most chaplains were attached to field ambulances and dressing stations. Unlike the Western Front, there was no guarantee that these postings were beyond the line of fire. So whether in hospital tents, dressing stations, or visiting the frontline trenches, chaplains shared the myriad dangers and deprivations experienced by officers and men. Principal Chaplain Horden, as we've seen, rescinded the order banning chaplains from the front line. Keith Best remarked on the 22nd of June that a senior chaplain observed that, quote, "his subordinates were now independent and they should proceed at their own discretion." Anglican chaplains Andrew Gilson and F.W. Ray experienced heavy enemy fire from the top of a gully. Such a storm of lead I had, of course, never seen before and could not have imagined, tearing up the ground and littering it with fragments of undergrowth and mangled men. Ray arrived at the Anzac at the beginning of May, described by Chaplain Ernest Merrington of the 3rd Australians Light Horse. Let's go back and see Ray. Here he is. The Padre himself was moving about in full view of the enemy and was a very conspicuous figure, as he wore a cover of maroon-coloured rubber suspended from his cap over the back of his neck. Ray, notebook in hand, was jotting down the names of the dead lying about the road edge. Merrington, well aware of the obvious target presented by wearing the distinctive officer's service dress uniform, decided to attire himself in the tunic of a light horse trooper, he said, with bandolier and slouch hat, but with no rifle. The large-scale German assault on the 19th of May was repulsed with heavy losses. Anzac chaplains Ray, Gillison and Green met with General John Monash to organise arrangements for the corpses to be transported by mule cart to a new cemetery in Shrapnel Valley. On the 24th of May, the famous truce was arranged to clear the decomposing dead from no man's land. Padre Dexter was an eyewitness of the grim clearance. He said, "Things are very quiet this morning. At 8:30, the armistice began for the purpose of burying the dead. The smell is something awful. Among this awful mess of dead Turks were some of our boys who had been killed on the first and second day's fight and have lain there since. The bodies were horrible to look at, being black and swelled up." Dexter went on to experience several close calls, including being grazed by a bullet in mid-September. "This is my sixth set," he said. "I must be pretty thick-skinned. A little iodine soon put things right." For his gallantry at Gallipoli, Dexter was awarded a DSO. William Grant, and here we have him here, of the Wellington Rifles, landed at Anzac on the 12th of May. On the 23rd of August, he had participated in the costly but ultimately unsuccessful general assault on Hill 60, where he was killed on the 28th. A fellow chaplain witnessed it. Quote, "He and I were dressing wounded and walked straight into the Turks. They were pretty rattled and their fire was wild. He was shot through the throat and died at once." Principal Chaplain Major John Luxford, Methodist, who had been sniped at Channock Bear on the 9th of August and lost his leg as a result, wrote that William Grant was one of heaven's peers. There's his memorial there. Killed in action in Gallipoli, 21st of August 1915, while succouring both friend and foe. On the 22nd of August, Andrew Gillison, accompanied by a former stretcher bearer and former Methodist minister R.H. Pittendry, entered no man's land to rescue a wounded man. Both were hit by the enemy, but enemy fire, but managed to return. Gilson's doctor declared his condition serious, but not hopeless. Gilson expressed relief that he would be okay, but soon lapsed into unconsciousness and died 3 hours later. His body was placed on a stretcher underneath a Union Jack, and he was buried by moonlight beside the Aegean Sea. The senior chaplain of the 2nd Division wrote to Mrs. Gillison of his admiration for her husband, saying, "The brigade, as well as his battalion, mourns his loss." Father Patrick Doe was severely injured on the 24th of August and would have been died if he had not been carried by Trooper Foley and several stretcher bearers back to the casualty clearing station, despite the system which required the wounded to go from one party to another. On making a full recovery, he subsequently served on the Western Front, where he then died of wounds in July 1918. Roman Catholic Padre H.C. Day landed at Silver Bay on the 18th of August. He was assigned to participate with 9 Corps in pending general assault on the 21st of August, and the 22nd Mounted Division, to which he was attached, moved inland to take up their assigned jumping off points. At Lana Barbara, Day learned of plans to cross the barren Anafata Plain. Quote, "Any attempt to cross that plain could only be made at the cost of terrible sacrifice of human life, but apparently it was unavoidable. Through this corridor of fire, the division walked steadily forward," he said. "In less than half an hour, we had lost 25% of our force. I cannot recall any example of collective coolness comparable to the silent passing of the yeomanry through that first ordeal of battle." Day reached Chocolate Hill at about 5 p.m. and was instrumental in identifying a track through the raging bushfire before assisting at the recently established Chocolate Hill dressing station. Over 1,000 wounded were attended to there, Day providing the last rites to the dying cases. For his part in the 2nd Mounted Division assault, Anglican chaplain Arthur Parham had also risked his life and limb to retrieve the wounded from bushfire. Thereafter, he organised volunteer stretcher bearers and, according to a Reading newspaper, was chiefly instrumental in evacuating the wounded from Chocolate Hill. Remaining under fire for the next 2 weeks, he went on to attend the wounded, direct burials and celebrate the Holy Communion services. Parham was awarded the Military Cross for his collective acts of bravery. The funeral services were necessary for religious and sanitary reasons. Considerable effort was made to identify the dead in the provision of Christian burial. Over time, disparate grave sites were arranged into cemeteries, but many bodies remained unidentified. Mackenzie, commentating on the human cost of the assault on Lone Pine, observed, quote, "The sight afterwards to the trenches was beyond conception. The piles of dead and dying were appalling, and the number of wounded was being continually increased as the number of Turks was constantly reinforced. My experiences of getting the wounded out of the trenches, over the dead and wounded, underneath the dead was sickening. When this was done, I buried in all some 450 men killed in this charge. These burials covered a period of 3 weeks when the smell of the bodies after the first few days was overpowering, and frequently I had to leave the graves to retch from the effects of the smells." Now, we're not forgetting the Navy. This is a church service on the Queen Elizabeth. And this is an anonymous padre who wrote 500,000 miles in a hospital ship, which I thoroughly recommend. It's a very good tale, told with quite a lot of humour and pathos. Yes, so a padre, this anonymous padre, was in a hospital ship transporting the wounded from Gallipoli, and he described a situation which is familiar to all chaplains. A severely injured patient needed an operation, and the outcome was far from certain. "It is a difficult and delicate task," he said, "to prepare a man for the worst happening, and yet at the same time not to scare him. I think this is the hardest job that falls to the lot of a chaplain. Certainly, it is one that demands all one's tact and discretion, to say just enough and not to say too much, to comfort and yet to warn at the same time." The padre seems to be on good terms with the medical staff, relating the good attendance of services and the sometimes critical appreciation of his sermons. At one stage, he acted as a producer to a play put on by the medical staff on board. So, what were the chaplains' opinions of what they did, of their experiences and their role? Father Fahy, one of the first chaplains to land, observed, "I feel that I have done more work during these 4 weeks than during all the years I have been a priest. I have had some wonderful manifestations of divine mercy during these weeks. I shall never volunteer again in any capacity, for I have seen enough. It is not so much personal fear that would deter me, but the awful sights and nerve-shaking ordeals of fire one has to go through." This statement was later tempered by the observation that, quote, "In spite of the inconvenience and horrors of war, I'm glad I came. I shall never regret being associated with such splendid men." Keith Best was appalled by the lack of medical organisation, and he expressed disgust at perceived incompetence that contributed to unnecessary deaths. He was also unreservedly critical of senior officers and employed tactics. Despite the awful conditions and difficulty in performing assigned tasks, most chaplains remained a firm sense of faith and justice of the cause. As H.C. Day subsequently observed, "What did I think of war? In a week it had robbed me of 2 of my friends and countless companions. Was it still fine? Or was it mean, murderous and dastardly? Have I changed my mind? No. From the outside, I gauged the calamity and counted the cost. Courage counts. Character and conduct live. In this sense, war is fine, splendid in life, most splendid of all, as I saw it in the grandeur of that last sacrifice." Conversely, Ernest Meriden, writing in October 1915, remarked, "My health is beginning to fail under the strain of the campaign," whilst Mackenzie said he had to force himself to continue following the ghastly Lone Pine attack. The situation was made worse when Horden ordered that, quote, no more chaplains be posted to the peninsula at that moment due to the smallness of the area. But by September, many chaplains had succumbed to dysentery. And of this, the chaplain general remarked, it is very difficult to keep a full supply of chaplains with the various units. Now, talking about the reaction of the troops, it's always more difficult to find out what men particularly thought, because chaplains kept diaries and wrote things after the war, officers kept diaries. But MEF chaplains, having got close to officers and men, remarked on their congregation's attitudes towards religion. Maitland Woods observed, their attitude to us of the clergy is, so far as I see it, quite changed. He also commented on the Bible's popularity. It is wonderful the way the men read their testaments. Men that did express their thoughts were mostly positive with regard to religious belief and chaplains. For example, Alan Trelaw remarked, this morning I went to divine service at 9:30. I've attended some strange services since I left Australia, but this one was the strangest of all. We met down in a gully, and there in the shelter of the cliffs we worshipped our God. Atop the cliff was a Maori working party, and the service was punctuated by these men dragging water tanks around. Quote, it was to this accompaniment that we sang hymns. For the sermon, we disposed ourselves comfortably, to use the words of the chaplain. The text was Revelations 21:5. And he that sat upon the throne, behold, I make all things new. The address was helpful, and altogether I felt it was good that I had been there. Such criticism that existed focused on the lack of services. Petty Officer Burt Webster complaining that Sunday, being just like any other day, we have not had the opportunity of attending a church service since we've landed here. On the 11th of October, Australian Private Cathy wrote, yesterday we had a church service. It seems so peculiar. At times you could not hear the parson for the noise. The prevailing conditions often prevented Sunday services. This fact was acknowledged by Captain Bill Knox, who said, they do have church services at all times, but so far I've not been able to go to one. One has one's job to do first. So, moving towards a conclusion. As the chaplain's role at Gallipoli represented a relatively unknown consequence of total war in the 20th century, as the revolution in military technology and consequent dominance of defensive warfare resulted in a learning process with regard to operations and tactics, so it was that the attitudes and actions that chaplains were also affected. Their collective experience was a multifaceted role involving pastoral, medical, and spiritual aspects, influenced by a necessity to be with their men, whether in the front line, base, or in hospital environments. Precise figures of the number of chaplains that served during the Gallipoli campaign are hard to establish. Chaplains Department records, although incomplete, show that at least 55 were present on the peninsula during the period 5th of April to the 9th of January. Furthermore, Michael McKernan notes that the Anzac chaplain were not organised on until later in the war, but estimate approximately 30 Australian chaplains took part. It is also known that of the 13 New Zealand chaplains who left New Zealand in September 1914, 6 landed at Gallipoli. Past First World War literature, particularly of Anglican chaplains, has been one of criticism by such well-known contemporary observers as Graves and Sassoon, but also from recent historians such as Stephen Langdon and Albert Marin, who have disparaged the Holy Grocery and morale-boosting aspects of military chaplaincy. Alan Wilkinson and Gordon Zahn have explored role conflict with chaplains, the latter remarking that, quote, by his very presence, the pastor in uniform represents a symbol of legitimacy. If it were not permissible for believers to take part in the war, would the priest be there? At variance with this perspective are the works of Michael Snape, Edward Mannican, and me, who have defended chaplains in studies which examine ministerial roles and effectiveness. More recent studies have considered the question of morale. Andrew Totten going far as to suggest that, quote, if the cause or simply the conduct of the fighting soldier were justified, why would the maintenance of the morale not be a proper object for concern? He also defines the difference between morale, the psychosocial state, and the moral or ethical state. Soldiers require an easing of conscience and of moral sensibility. Maintenance of good morals was, as much as promotion of moral and ethical values, a vital part of the chaplain's portfolio. Totten continues, quote, "The challenge ethically is to generate morale that is grounded on civilized behaviour." Having demonstrated how the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force chaplains were present in a soldier's life throughout the campaign, it can be concluded that they were an important aspect of the maintenance of morale in the truest sense of the word. Much of the criticism levelled at the time and since then was inapplicable to Gallipoli. Complaints about the dearth of chaplains, the early disorganisation of the army, the Army Chaplains Department does not appear to have been a problem on the peninsula. Despite sickness among chaplains, Principal Chaplain Horden seems to have worked hard to bring about a balance in the requirements for a steady supply of personnel. This increased presence, combined with assignments to the constricted peninsular battle zone, increased chaplain initiative and flexibility. For some, however, it was never apparent what their role should be. Chaplains' personal accounts often speak of meetings with other denominations of chaplains with regard to joint services, funeral arrangements, and other tasks. Thus, it appears there were some exceptions that the diverse Christian padres worked well together to the greater good. The Holy Grocery criticism was less prominent at Gallipoli, although some chaplains recalled procurement and distribution of cigarettes and large quantities of sweets. Circumstances at Gallipoli did not allow for a regular establishment of canteens, entertainment, or sports. Indeed, chaplain accounts are more often than not primarily concerned with dodging shells and the fire to take services. With no safe place or beyond the landing beaches, criticisms of the chaplains not sharing the dangers experienced by their spiritual charges are less relevant. As previously discussed, padres were prevented from participating in the initial landings on the grounds of taking up a limited space on the assault boats. Despite the dreadful conditions and enormous casualties, chaplains retained a just war perspective and promoted spiritual comfort and cheerful endurance. Church parades, the cause of much resentment in France, were seldom organised on the peninsula. This provided padres with a much greater scope to convene informal voluntary services that appear to have been popular and well attended. Thus, a variety of circumstances peculiar to the Gallipoli campaign conspired to allow for an increased engagement with ethical challenges. With spiritual charges, something their clerical counterparts on the Western Front found difficult to emulate throughout 1915. Subsequent service in other theatres provided the Gallipoli chaplains with the opportunity to serve as valuable role models to less experienced contemporaries. As Michael McKernan, in a poignant observation, said, "Chaplains now were on an equal footing with all. There were no distinctions or props to rescue a man from the steady gaze of his fellows. At Gallipoli, each read each other's souls." Thank you very much.